Toronto is gone.
Uh-huh.
How you doing with the COVID there?
Well, we both had our second dose finally, our second vaccine, so we're okay.
Good.
We're
Good.
trying to get permission to go to Israel. Toronto is gone.
Oh, you did. Now you have.
Lost
Harriet.
Right. Let's see. I got it. My battery is low. I gotta go plug it in.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, Harriet.
Harriet, how you doing?
And hello, Sam. So nice to have you, Sam. So glad you're here.
Hi, Sam.
Rabbi, I'm gonna need share screen if you can let me share my screen.
One of the things about my Zoom room is that I don't restrict anybody from doing anything.
Okay.
So,
After that.
so actually, as part of this B'nai Mitzvah celebration yesterday, we had 60 people on the Zoom, and the Torah reading. We always put the text of the Torah up on the screen. And there were people, and according to the woman who was taking care of the technology yesterday, she said there were 2 or 3 different people who were making annotations to that. So complete legitimacy to do anything you want. And if anyone else obviously shares instead of you, I will squash them. So
Okay, fair enough.
What is that? How are they making annotations? How do they do that?
Sherry, I have no idea.
We'll find out when it comes out in the papers.
Completely. I didn't know that anyone who was not actually sharing could make annotations, but I guess that is actually possible. So anyway.
You mean annotate the door?
To the Chumash.
Oh my God! What?
Well, maybe they just put it in chat.
No, what they did was that they took purple and green marker and they were making designs.
Oh, really?
Oh my gosh.
My guess is
Boredom.
yeah, my guess.
Boredom.
I guess is
Hidur mitzvah.
yeah.
Yeah.
I
They were
saw
doing
that.
it. They were doing it in Rashi
I wondered
script.
what was going on.
They were doing it in Rashi script.
I noticed one of them, but I didn't know that there were 3.
Oh, that's right. You showed us.
Technology
Yes.
allow for doing that.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well,
I have
probably
tried
to let it do anything.
text on the screen to make it easier for me to read, and I can't do it. If I have a Word document on my screen, I can expand that, but there's something about it when it's your screen that I'm getting to see, I can't change it at all as far as I'm able to find.
I didn't know that. Well, in any case, with no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Sherry so she can introduce Professor Hundert.
Okay, so when we announced that Professor Gershon Hundert was coming to talk to us, we led on. Jim said that he is one of my oldest friends. And I said, no, he's not that old. But
Thank you. I lost the second. Sherry, you're muted.
my goodness, how did that happen? I didn't see that coming. Oh, okay. Did you hear anything or?
You said I was not old.
Okay. Well, at least you heard that right. And so that's how it came about. We actually, so it's a long story, but I'll just go right to the chase. Gershon Hundert is now the Leonore Siegel Professor of Jewish Studies and Professor of History at McGill University. His main field of interest is early modern Poland, Lithuania, and he has a fascinating story to tell us. And without further ado, here he goes.
Okay, I'm going to try this share screen thing. Okay, can you see the map?
Yep.
Oh. Got out of control. Yeah. Okay. I want to just go down a little. It's the wrong part of the map. Okay. So let me say, first of all, this talk, it's not really a talk. So it will only work if you interrupt me with questions. Because I've been working on this material for so long that I can't figure out a way to condense it. So I need to be led by your questions. I'll just say a couple of general things and I'll tell you the story about finding the manuscripts. And then I hope you will ask me questions about the time. So when I teach my course on Jews in Poland, I always start off by saying that between Germany and Russia is no place to have a country. And this accomplishes two purposes. People find it funny, and also the students get some idea of where Poland is. We're in the region that you see, I hope, on the screen, which is in the Lvov region. That's a Polish spelling of this place. It has several other names. Lemberg, Lviv in Ukrainian, which is how you find it today, Lvov in Russian, Lemberg, but it's all the same place, and it's in southeastern Poland in the 18th century. At the moment, it's in western Ukraine, or you can think of it as Galicia, which it was in between 1772 and the end of the First World War. So we're in Poland, Lithuania, in the 18th century. There are 750,000 Jews living in Poland, Lithuania in the 18th century. That's about 4 to 6% of the total population of the country. But it's actually much more than that, because you have to remember that 90% of the population is agrarian, rural peasantry. So Jews, in fact, made up something around half of the urban population of Poland, Lithuania. Half the people in the cities and towns of the country were Jews. So it's a very large community. The largest Jewish community in the world is there. Most Jews today are descended from these people, because there were no Jews in Russia at the time. They only came to Russia when Russia took a bite out of Poland and annexed the territory. So we're talking about a very large community that lives its life. The dailiness of life was Jewish. They spoke Yiddish. They bumped into mostly Jews. The rhythm of their calendar was a Jewish calendar. The rhythm of their day depended on the times of prayer, at least for the men. So this is a very densely Jewish population. And they're living in a country that is multi-ethnic. Only 40% of the population of Poland, Lithuania was ethnically Polish in the 18th century. There are many other groups. Most obviously Ukrainians and Ruthenians and Belarusians and Lithuanians, but there were also Germans and Armenians and Tatars and Italians and Scots. I once wrote an article comparing Scots and Jews in Poland, and when I got to Scotland, I got some very good single malt whiskey out of that article. And most of the sources that I work with are either our Polish archival sources, or Ukrainian or Russian or Lithuanian archival sources, or literature written by Jews. And that literature is virtually all of it written by rabbis. No offense intended, but that skews the direction of the character of the material you're dealing with. So what I'm talking about today is 2 books written by a person who was not a rabbi. So it's extremely, extremely unusual to have such literature. And we knew about it. We knew about this man. His name was Dov Ber Birkenthal, if I can get this to work. Well, he's on the left. Maybe if I,
Professor Hundert,
yes,
I have a quick question before you let go of the map.
go ahead. Whoops.
I noticed the helm is on there, and I was wondering whether you had any information as to why they were so honored as to have the tradition we have about their intelligence.
It's a 19th century thing. The Chelm was a perfectly respectable city, and the people who lived there didn't think of themselves as trying to capture the moon in a barrel or any of that. It's some kind of 19th century literary tradition that associated Chelm as a city of fools. There were several other cities of fools, a couple of them near Lviv, actually. But how a town merits this kind of I don't know, discrimination, I really don't, I can't tell you. I don't know. But thank you for asking, because I need people to ask questions. So let me see if I can get this slideshow. You can sort of see it. There. Dovber Birkenthal of Bolechov. He was a wine merchant like his father. He used to travel to the Tokaj region of Hungary through the Carpathian Mountains and bring back wine and sell it to noblemen, to high-placed churchmen, to rich city dwellers, and he did reasonably well at this. And he wrote two books. One we don't have the title page for, so we don't know what he called it. But people have been referring to it as his memoirs because it reads like a memoir. It's a kind of description of his life and events in his life with some other material that isn't memoir-like. So people call it the memoirs. And those memoirs were published partly, let me see if I can fix this. There. The memoirs partly were published partly in 1922 by Marek Vishnitzer. He published the original Hebrew, he published an English translation, and he published a Yiddish translation of those memoirs. But he made a mess of it. He had 6 fascicles, you know, 6 little folders of pages, and he got them the order completely wrong. And he didn't refer to the other. There was a second version of the memoirs which he simply ignored when he published it. So what I've done is I've taken the 2 versions, put them together, and edited them in Hebrew, and that is going to be published if everything goes according to plan in the first quarter of 2022 by Mossad Bialik. Probably in 2 volumes. So let me tell you the story of finding this stuff. What happened was that I was in a sort of professor's heaven in Jerusalem, the Institute for Advanced Study, it's called, at the Hebrew University. And the group was studying Hasidism. Eventually, that group produced this big, thick book called A New History of Hasidism that came out of that group. And I was kind of, I wasn't interested in Hasidism especially, but I was kind of the historian, more general historian in the group. And I was just finishing the editing of an encyclopedia of Jews in Eastern Europe that you can find online. It's called the YIVO Encyclopedia of Jews in Eastern Europe. That took 7 years. And it was, I was doing the final proofreading and all of that at the end of it. And I was looking for a new project. And I had this idea of writing a book about a town in Ukraine called Uman. In Uman in 1768, there was a massacre of Jews by something like Cossacks. And also Rabbi Nachman of Braslav went there to live at the end of his life because he said he wanted to pray for the martyrs of that massacre. And then a decade or 2 decades later, approximately, supposedly, the first modern Jewish school in the Russian Empire was created in Uman. And nowadays, you may know, it is a pilgrimage site for Chassidim. It used to be only Braslav Chassidim, but nowadays just tens of thousands of mostly Haredi Jews go there for Rosh Hashanah. So I had this idea, I'd write a book in 4 chapters, one for each of these things. And I was reading material about the attack, which was the kind of Cossack uprising in the 18th century. And I came across in the published archival stuff that was published in Ukraine from the archives, I came across an account of an attack on the town of Bolechuv in 1759 by some other bandits who are called Oprichki. But for the Ukrainian historians, this was in the days before 1989. Any kind of popular movement was good and deserved a lot of attention. It showed that the lower classes were rising up and demanding their rights and all of that sort of thing. And so they had published in the collection of documents about Cossacks and Ukrainian social movements a description of the archival material from this attack on Bolechuv in 1759. And they talked about, the documents reflected the capture and the interrogation of the bandits who had made this attack. And when I was reading that, I remembered that Dov Ber of Bolechuv, in the published version of his memoirs, describes exactly that attack. So I compared the two. I compared his account and the account I had from the archives. I got very excited because they matched exactly, even to the point there was one Jew who defended his warehouse with a gun in each hand, shooting at these bandits, and had succeeded in wounding one of them. And sure enough, in the court documents, they say that one Jew was shooting and he wounded the leader of the group in trying to fight off. And there's some other details match. So that was, it gave me a lot of pleasure. And I published an article right away about the veracity of this account and all of that. And then, of course, later I found some more sources. One of the victims of the Jewish victims actually describes the attack in another book, but so I was too quick to publish. But it made me interested in Birkenthal, and Birkenthal, we knew, had written another book that he called in Hebrew Divrei Bina, which means understanding words. And it is a history of messianism, a history of Jewish messiahs. And the manuscript of that book had never been published in full. Only a certain part of it had been published around the time of the First World War. But the manuscript was about 100 yards from where I was sitting in Jerusalem in this group. So I took myself down to the manuscript collection of the National Library, and I asked to see the manuscript of Divrei Bina. There's a sort of another part of this story that manuscript had been lost because somebody put it out of alphabetical order in the file. So for about 15 years, nobody could find it until somebody clever went through and found it. In any case, I got it and I started reading it. It was astonishing. I mean, the part that I was reading parts that had not been published, the introduction to this book called Divrei Bina, and he gives in about 30 or 40 pages, Birkenthal, a kind of history of his time, a really synthetic, comprehensive chapter describing his era. And it's beautifully done. And he mentions, among other things, the Baal Shem Tov, the putative founder of Hasidism. And I was in this group at this institute that was studying Hasidism. So I came back to the group. And we used to, at lunchtime, everybody would take turns. Everybody would present for about 10 minutes, whatever they were working on at that moment. And so I revealed to the group that I had found a contemporary reference to the Besht, and they were all excited about it. Of course, the reference said that this person had looked into the teachings of the Besht and they were perfectly worthless. Birkendahl had no love for these Chassidim. But in any case, it was exciting. And then I sort of began to pursue this. And I looked again at the memoirs, at this published version of the memoirs. And at the very beginning, he says, in his introduction, he says, 2 scholars have published little bits of these memoirs even before me, before 1922. So normally when you read something like that, where you say, well, I have the whole thing here. Why do I have to go see what was published before, little bits of it? But I went and checked, and one of the scholars had 2 versions of the memoirs. And at one point in his article, he puts the 2 versions in parallel columns, comparing them. Vishnitzer never mentions that there were 2 versions. So I wanted to see the other version that he didn't publish. So the 2 scholars' names were Marmerstein and Levin. And Levin's archive is at Yeshiva University. So I went to New York and sat and went through his archive in the library. That was very interesting. He turns out to have been something of a kleptomaniac. He stole manuscripts from all over the place in Europe before he went to the West. But there was nothing of Birkendahl's in this collection. So that left Marmerstein. So nowadays, we have the internet. So I got on the internet and I found out that Marmerstein, I knew his name. He had published a book on called Aspects of Rabbinic Theology that I knew. So he had taught at Jews College in London. And I found out that he had bequested his library to the University of Manchester, to the John Rylands Library. It's a very famous collection. And so I wrote to them. I said, do you have manuscripts in the Marmerstein collection? They wrote back to me, we have only books. Stymied. What happened to the manuscript? So then I was talking to a scholar who she died just a year ago. Her name was Ada Rappaport Albert. And she told me that one of her colleagues was friends with the grandson of Professor Marmerstein. And this grandson was a Satmar Chassid who lived in London. And so I got in touch with a colleague. I got the telephone number of this grandson, and I called him on the phone. And I said, do you have any manuscripts from your Zayda? He's a Satmar Chassid. So he said, no, everything went to Manchester. So I said, but they told me they have only books. And then he said, they don't know what they have. So I wrote again. I looked at the University of Manchester website, and I found somebody teaching Jewish studies. I didn't know him. But I said, please do me a favor, go to the library and see if you can figure out what's going on. Are there manuscripts there? And a few weeks later, I got a very apologetic letter from the librarian. They had found a box that had manuscripts in it, apparently, but they couldn't just open it. It hadn't been opened since 1954. You can't just open it because of atmospheric problems and preservation and whatnot. And in any case, eventually, he wrote to me that he had opened the box and he found a file that was labeled, he doesn't read Hebrew, so he doesn't know what was in the manuscript, but the label on the file was the Memoirs of Dov Ber of Bolechu. So I got on a plane and went to Manchester. And I spent 7 days in a row in this library. And it rained every one of those 7 days. I didn't see much of Manchester except a cab driver pointed out to me where Mr. Rolls had met Mr. Royce. In the lobby of some hotel. But I had them, I started reading, and it was clearly stuff that Vishnitzer had not published. There's another version of the memoirs, It had very interesting stuff. I don't know, is anybody there from Chicago in this group? Well, in Chicago, they have a holiday, or they used to have a holiday called Pulaski Day, in honor of a Polish, I don't know if he was a general, but a high-ranking officer who fought in the American Revolution named Pulaski. In these memoirs, Mr. Pulaski, who at the time was fighting the Russians as part of a Polish confederacy, Mr. Pulaski, General Pulaski, came for lunch to the home of Dovber of Bolechov, and he was very happy. His wife was very happy because he happened to come on Purim, and she had prepared a Purim feast, a Purim Suda, a Purim meal, with two kinds of fish. And I'm very unhappy. It's too bad that he doesn't tell us what was the difference between the two kinds of fish. I assume one was savory and one was sweet. One was Litvish and one was Galiciano. I don't know. She doesn't say. He doesn't say. But they served him fish, and he tells about this encounter with General Pulaski there. And some other materials that are really very interesting. So ever since then, I've been editing these two books in Hebrew, with the identifying the quotations and whatnot. The thing is, why did a wine merchant write a history of Jewish messianism? Well, the answer to that. Where's the cartoon? Here. You probably can't see. Oops. Can you see that at all?
A little bit.
I don't know if I can.
That's a lot better.
These are caricatures from a Jewish book by Jacob Emden. And unfortunately, we don't know the name of the artist who made these woodcuts, but they're satirical woodcuts telling the story of what happened in 1757. But before I get to that, let me just go back a bit. I assume, you have to tell me, I assume you know about Shabtai Tzvi and Jacob Frank. Is that?
Well, some of us do, but some of us might not. So a quick thing,
Okay, so in 1665, word came from the land of Israel that the Messiah had arrived, and his name was Shabtai Tzvi, and soon he would take the crown from the head of the Sultan and place it on his own head, and all of the Jews will be transported back to the Holy Land, and all of the various messianic visions would be fulfilled. And this electrified the Jewish world all over the place, from Amsterdam to Persia and North Africa and Yemen. Everywhere, people were very excited that the Messiah had come. But then, of course, the Turkish Sultan got word that there was this Jew going around saying he was going to take the crown off his head and put it on his own head, which led to his being arrested and placed under not difficult conditions, but a sort of house arrest near Constantinople. This Messiah, whose name was Shabtai Tzvi, received visitors from all over the place. And one of them was a Nehemiah Cohen from Poland, who thought he was the Messiah, and they had a great debate. And eventually, the people around Shabtai Tzvi made some threatening gestures toward him that he was challenging their Messiah. So he went out of the room and went to the the Ottoman officials, and said that Shabtai Tzvi was teaching seditious ideas, fomenting possible treason. And so Shabtai Tzvi was brought before the vizier and given a choice between conversion and death, and he chose to stay alive and to convert to Islam. That made most of his followers become disillusioned with him as the Messiah, but not all of them. When I teach this, I always say that an apostate Messiah is even more paradoxical than a crucified Messiah. But there are always paradoxes connected with messianic movements. And so some people were so enchanted with the feeling that they were now living in a world that had been redeemed, a messianic world, that they didn't want to let go of that, and despite the facts. If the facts seem to contradict their feelings, the facts just need an explanation. And they concocted a kind of theology of a converted Messiah, which Sholem called redemption through sin. But in any case, what we have to know for present purposes is there persisted among Jews in various parts of the world a belief that Shabtai Tzvi was indeed the Messiah, and the process was nearing completion. Some Jews, especially in Salonika, followed Shabtai Tzvi into Islam to assist him in his struggles with the powers of evil, so that the final redemption could occur. And some did not. And they had to go underground because the establishment excommunicated people who continued to believe in Shabtai Tzvi for obvious reasons, right? Jews who are Muslims are not deserve excommunication. Now, there were such groups in Poland, and they were also underground, as it were, secret, but not really secret. People knew. I mean, you don't have secrets. The level of surveillance that people lived with in the 18th century was such that there were no secrets. You really couldn't keep anything private in those periods. But the philosophy seemed to be, as long as they don't do anything in public to show that they're not following I don't know, the Orthodox practice, okay, as long as they don't bother anybody. A lot of these people were pietists. They would fast a lot, and they would study Kabbalah, study Zohar. So they presented as pious, observant, God-fearing people, and secretly they'd eat one currant on the Day of Atonement, on Yom Kippur, to show that they don't really believe that the halakha applies anymore because the Messiah came. So the central group was in Salonika, and at a certain point, a Jew whose origins were in southern Poland called, we'll call him Jacob Frank from the beginning, Jakob Leibovich, on his wedding day, his father told him that the family were Sabbatian, and he taught him about these beliefs. And this was a very charismatic person, and he ends up in Salonika and becomes the leader of the Sabbatian group, or one of them. And then he embarks on a program of, what should we say, evangelizing? It's not the right word, right?
Yeah.
But teaching, recruiting. And he goes back to Poland and he tours the various Sabbatian groups. And he says, you should not hide. This hiding out, this being underground, that's not the way. It hasn't got you anywhere. You ought to come out in public and show that you don't buy any systems, that you don't believe any of these teachings or any of these ideas. And he organizes a ceremony about which we have several reports. And depending on the report, depending on the description you read, it is either just an out-and-out orgy, or it's some kind of strange ritual involving Christian symbols and naked women. But in any case, we have several descriptions of this, and this became public. Frank seems to have created conditions in which people would find out what had happened in this town. It's called Lanz Corona. And it did become known, and the rabbinic authorities turned the Frankists, the Sabbatian Frankists, over to the church authorities to be prosecuted for heresy and for founding a new religion. They did this on the advice of the person in whose book these caricatures, these satiric caricatures appear. He said, look, we want these people executed. They have to be destroyed. They're evil, they're immoral, they don't deserve to be part of the community. And so they were. This was a terrible mistake strategically on the part of the Jewish leadership, but I can't go into that now. In any case, the Frankists were, of course, excommunicated. And you can't be, in the 18th century, you can't be not a Jew and not a Christian. There's no place. So they offered to convert to Christianity. And the bishop at the time, who's in Kamieniec, said, well, we want you to participate in a public debate to show that the Talmud is blasphemous and anti-Christian and blasphemes the Holy Family and so on, deserves to be burnt. And so they did. In 1757, they participated in this public disputation. There were several Frankists, some of them were scholars, and about 40 rabbis. And of course, the decision of the court was foreordained. The Talmud was convicted and burned. We don't know how many volumes, but there were books burned as a result. And then, and the Frankists were, of course, protected by this bishop who expected them to convert to Christianity. Then, within a couple of weeks, the bishop died. And the Jews thought that the death of the bishop was divine punishment for what he had done to the Talmud. And that's what these caricatures are about, showing that there was no escape for this bishop who persecuted Jewish books. And the Frankists were in a lot of trouble. They had lost their patron. And they were being stoned and beaten up and otherwise treated very shabbily by the Jewish community. They had nowhere to go. So they went to Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, and then they were brought back by another bishop who thought he could use them for his interests. His name was Soltik, and he brings them back, gets them a royal writ of protection, and here again, we have several different accounts, but at one way or another, the Frankists agreed to participate in another public disputation, this time in the cathedral in Lviv, at which they would prove that the Jews use Christian blood in their ceremonies. And they require Christian blood to obey the commandments that are in the Talmud and in their books of codes of law, which they did. And this disputation debate took place in 1759, over 3 months. It got an enormous amount of attention all over Europe. It was in the fledgling newspaper industry, took a lot of interest. People were following what was going on. And our Birkenthal served as the translator to Polish because he knew Polish and German, as well as some French and some Latin. And so he had translated the answers of the rabbi who had to answer this seventh question at the debate, at the disputation, which had to do with the blood libel. And so this was the impetus, I think, I'm pretty sure, for his writing this book, Divrei Bina, because at the end of the book, there are, I don't know, about 60 pages of more or less firsthand account of what happened at this debate, and especially what happened at the end of it when they finally came to this question of Jews using Christian blood in their ceremonies. And as I say, I think that's what made him made him write this history of Messianism.
Who did he think his audience was going to be?
Well, he wanted to publish both books. There are references inside the books about that, and we also have a letter from his son-in-law to the rabbi of the Louvre, in which he says, "We're waiting for your answer, for your haskama, so he would give an approbation, an approval for the publication of this book." That haskama never came, and some people think it was because the rabbi didn't want this book published. It was too anti-Christian, too outspokenly anti-Christian, and so he didn't want to give it approval. But we can't prove that. We simply have the expression of impatience. But in any case, they were never published. But he wrote it for his family, and he wrote it for publication. I think that's why he writes in Hebrew. And one of the obvious questions, he sticks to Hebrew. He's very insistent. And there are maybe a dozen Yiddish words in the whole thing. There are more Polish words, I think, and German words than there are Yiddish words. And I think that was, my guess is that was a manifestation of a kind of social climbing. In Yiddish, there's a distinction between a sefer and a buch. A buch is ephemeral. It's in Yiddish. It's kind of something that you can only read when you're not supposed to be reading anything sacred. And a sefer is something that's part of the canon. That's part of, it's a holy object. If you drop it, you have to kiss it, right? That kind of thing. And such books are in Hebrew. And I think he wanted to find a place for himself in that kind of intellectual elite of people who wrote books in Hebrew. That's my best guess to explain why he would not write in Yiddish, which obviously would have been much easier for him than writing in Hebrew. One of the wonderful things is his Hebrew is very clear. It's a Mishnaic Hebrew, no militzot. Sherry, what's militza in English?
Metaphors or exaggerations?
Yeah, kind of flowery prose that was actually characteristic of this period and a little later. It's almost impenetrable. His is very clear Hebrew. I can show you maybe. I'm waiting. I have for more questions. This is his grave. It's still standing in Bolechu. And can you see the little grapes?
Yes.
Yeah, that's it. That he was a wine merchant. So, and he's the only one before 1820 who uses his government authorized family name, Birkenthal. Every other person buried before 1820 simply has a patronymic. Esther, the son of Mordecai, but no family name. He's the only one with that, with a last name for before 1820. This is a page, I have about 20 pages like this, which is a kind of fair copy, ready for the publisher, with no crossing out and this is the cover page of Divrei Binah that I found in John Ryland's library. Here too, you can see that a lot of care was taken.
Like no.
Can you see it?
Yes, I thought maybe some of it looked like Rashi script, but I take it back.
Yeah, well, this is the Aleph here it's partly sort of Rashi script.
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah, so this is the cover page of Divrei Binah. This is just a different draft of the memoirs. You can see it's reasonably legible. I mean, I was very lucky with this. There are some places where it's not as clear as this, but it's not so bad.
You know, our book club recently read Zahor by Yerushalmi. I talked, written to you about that.
Yes.
And from, and broadly speaking, he was saying that there were no histories written. There
Yeah.
was a sort of an injunction not to be writing history, Jewish history. Would you consider this an exception or not a history, or how does that fit into his?
Well, he's writing history, both in both books. He quotes at great length from other books in the way that history was done before this is the time when history becomes a profession, when Gibbon and company and Hume and others are inventing history as we know it. So he doesn't know about that, but he knows about the older style of writing history, which is you bring together multiple sources. Since there's only one true history, you just have to tell it in your way. So he does that in Divrei Binah. He has long quotations from two historians, one an Englishman called Prideaux, and one an Italian called Botero. Botero's book is one of these. It was written in the 16th century. It's a history of the world, and it pays a lot of attention to the part that Birkenthal was interested in was in the history of Africa, and specifically the history of Abyssinia or Ethiopia, because Ethiopia had a Jewish king, and that was very important to him to show that the Jews had exercised sovereignty long after the time of Jesus. He also has a long passage from Prideaux, who was an 18th century Anglican divine, a historian. They were all worried about chronology, resolving the apparent contradictions between classical histories like Xenophon and biblical history, and showing that there's no contradiction. The most famous one is Usher, I guess, who does that, but Prideaux does that too, and Birkenthal translates from a German translation of the English book into Hebrew, the section dealing with the Babylonian exile and the edict, eventually the Edict of Cyrus. And the Botero, he translates from a Polish translation of the Italian book. So what I had to do is I had to sit with the books that he was translating and his translation to show so I'd know when he skips and when he mistranslates or when he alters the content of the original. So my favorite is when Botero is describing the kingdom of Ethiopia. He says that the people paid taxes on Easter and Christmas and the feast of a certain saint. And in the translation that Birkenthal preserved, he says they paid their taxes on the three pilgrimage festivals. He kind of Judaizes the text. There's a long tradition of this sort of stuff, but he does that as well. When the author says something that contradicts his thesis, like when the description of the Ethiopians suggests that they were Christians, he says the author here is telling lies. I'll just skip this part and go on to the next one. So he uses this material as he sees fit.
So he doesn't feel an injunction to not write history.
No, not at all.
History.
No, he's trying to use history to serve his purpose. This is not. He says, I mean, there's a kind of ambivalence in him about this. He says there are things that we can learn from reading these books she'ein lanu b'Kabbalah shelanu, that we don't have in our tradition, and it's valuable to know that. So he sees a kind of intrinsic value in reading beyond the circumscribed canon of what a Jew would be expected to read. And at the same time, he's using this material to buttress his parochial interest as a Jew in refuting Christian theological claims. You know, one of the most common articles of debate between Jews and Christians going back to the church fathers and certainly in the Middle Ages is based on the Christian interpretation of a verse at the end of Genesis that says, the scepter the scepter will not depart from Judah until Shiloh comes. Lo yasur shevet meYehuda ad ki yavo Shiloh. And the Christian reading of that is the scepter will not depart from Judah until Jesus comes. They read Shiloh as Jesus. And so the proof that Jesus is prophesied, foreseen in the Bible, one of the proofs is this verse, because in fact, when Jesus came, the temple was destroyed, the Jews lost sovereignty and lost the scepter of rule, and Christianity displaced it. So that's why it's important to him to show that there was a Jewish king of Ethiopia, 1,000 years later, more, that in fact the scepter had not departed. So he's using it for his own purposes and trying to refute Christian argument.
There's a question here about getting to the issue of the blood libel.
Yeah. Well, it's shocking, right? I mean, the idea that Jews, even Jews who are about to convert to Christianity, would make this argument in public. We would actually support such an argument. There are a few things going on. One is that Bishop Soltich, who I mentioned, who brings them back and protects them, had just carried out, supervised, fomented, and caused a blood libel trial that led to the judicial murder of, I think it's 8 Jews under terrible torture. And he gets attacked. It's the end of the 18th century. People were not so sure that Jews were doing such terrible things. I should mention that there were several blood libels in precisely at this time. One of them, the Frankists apparently organized after the debate in 1759. But the Council of Four Lands, the sort of Jewish parliament of Poland, had sent an embassy to the Vatican to try to get the Pope to intervene to stop these accusations from taking place and the murder of Jews under torture. And the Vatican had taken this request seriously. They'd appointed a famous professor from Paris to look into it. And the conclusion was that there was no basis for such an accusation. And the bishops in Poland knew, right at the time that the Frankists were making this accusation under Soltich's sponsorship, they knew that the matter was up for debate in the Vatican, and the weight of the evidence was leaning toward exculpating Jews of this accusation. So in the end of the disputation, the Jews are convicted of blasphemy. I mean, all kinds of the Talmud has blasphemous things in it, but there is no decision by the church court, by the curia of the bishops, no decision on the question of ritual murder, precisely because there were voices in the church that disputed whether there was any basis for it. And the papal emissary in Poland was one of them. So they were cautious about this, and they did not announce a verdict that said that the accusation was true. blood libels were stopped occurring for about 100 years in Poland when torture was abolished in judicial proceedings in 1788 or so. The method of prosecuting a person was to get them to confess. That was how court proceedings worked in this period. And in order to get them to confess, torture was used. Torture was abolished in Polish courts at the end of the 18th century, and that marked the end of this accusation for quite a long time, because you couldn't get people to confess, certainly without torture. That was the only reason they did confess to such things.
No, I'm sure there are some other folks who have some questions. I know that our friend Seymour Epstein in Toronto definitely has a question. Yeah, maybe not. So are you saying then that that the Frankists were the originators of the blood libels? You're not saying that.
No. The blood libel, the accusation that Jews use Christian blood, or there are really two accusations that get blended together. One is ritual murder, and one is the blood accusation, right? The ritual murder accusation antedates the blood libel. So the first case we know of an accusation of ritual murder comes from England in 1144, when Jews were accused of reenacting the crucifixion and having a child called William of Norwich as their victim. The accusation, there was no court case. I mean, it's simply recorded in the Chronicles. And the cathedral in Norwich became a pilgrimage point because he became famous, this William of Norwich. You may know that one of the Canterbury Tales is based about Aaron of Lincoln, another such case in England, but there were no trials. And then as it crosses the channel, this idea, it gets combined with the notion that the Jews need Christian blood for their rituals, or to rid themselves of the scent of fire and brimstone that comes on them when they meet with their patron, the devil or Lucifer or Satan, and they come out stinking of sulfur, and so they need Christian blood to purify themselves. And these things get combined together with Easter, because that's when the crucifixion occurs. So the Christians are in mourning, and who crucified Jesus? The Jews, and they're accused of reenacting this sin, and eventually they're accused of needing Christian blood to make their unleavened bread. You need Christian blood to make matzot. And these kinds of trials, the first one went in on that across the channel was in Blois in the beginning of the 13th century, and then in Fulda in Germany in 1236. And after that, you get multiple cases. The most famous at the time was Simon of Trent, at which there was a major church investigation. It's connected to the Reformation. It's a very complicated story, but there the church concluded that it's possible that this really happened, that the Jews did indeed murder Simon of Trent to get his blood for their ritual purposes, and that provided a kind of precedent for subsequent writing about the blood libel. And then, of course, it revives at the end of the 19th century. You have cases in Hungary and in Russia, the Bayless case, and even in the second half of the 20th century, you hear there were some cases that sounded like blood libels in France in the 1960s. It's still around in various places. Some of the echoes nowadays on QAnon and whatnot about infant child abuse and murder and drinking their blood has echoes of some of this stuff. So it's still there somewhere in the recesses of the minds of strange people.
You think to some extent it was based on the use of blood in the sacrificial cults in the temple?
There are different ideas about this. I mean, you know, there's a whole psychoanalytic shtick that I I don't have much time for, but some people point out that when this first occurs, the 12th, 13th century, is the time when people are required to take communion.
Right.
So taking communion involves eating God. And at the same time, the image of the infant Jesus becomes very prominent in Christian iconography. So some kind of mix-up there of guilt about incorporating God and the killing of a child and the blood and the bread, right? The wafer and the wine, all of that seems to be somehow related, but it's not the kind of stuff I'm good at speculating. I think that more than the descriptions of the blood in the sacrifices in Leviticus or something. But you know, I don't know. It would be hard to prove any of that.
How about our friends Aria and Flora Davidson in New York?
Oh, there they
You
are.
have a question? Don't you guys have a question?
Really?
Near Pulaski Avenue in Chicago.
Ah,
Oh,
okay.
Pulaski was a big hero
Yeah,
among the Poles in Chicago.
yeah.
Sure, Bible.
But there also were a lot of synagogues there. I find it fascinating how you were able to trace and track down these various sources. You described it over the past half hour or so, as being very fulfilling, and the ideal of research for a historian. Were there also down points? I mean, were there points where you felt you were coming to a dead end?
Oh yeah, sure. But the main one of the main disappointments is I don't like this guy very much. He's really full of himself, and he seems to be competing with his older brother, who was much more prominent, but who didn't write anything. And who
You
was
should
an
hear how he
advocate.
feels about you.
Yeah. Fortunately, I don't have to ask him. I can ask him all I want. I'll never hear the answer. He's a self-aggrandizer. He puffs himself up a lot. So it's too bad. And I wish he had more. You know, the thing with this kind of stuff is he tells us what he tells us, and then there are oceans of things that he never mentions, and that you desperately want to know.
Yeah.
What he would have said about them, but he's simply not there, so you can't ask him. He has one sentence, a sentence and a half, about in 1789, Joseph II, the Habsburg emperor, Austrian emperor, issued what's called the Toleranz Patent. It was an edict of toleration of Jews. He had already made an edict of toleration of Protestants, and then he issued an edict of toleration of Jews, so that Jews and Protestants and Catholics there would be no discrimination among them, and their legal standing would be equal. So this was a revolutionary step. And Birkenthal mentions this in one sentence, and the sentence seems to say that the emperor must be weak-minded to issue such a statement, because, and this is my interpretation. He says it's obviously cannot be that all religions are equal and people can choose whatever religion they like, because obviously there's only one true religion and they're not equal. And he suggests in this sentence and a half that Joseph II got the idea for his edict of tolerance from Jacob Frank. Only a person like Jacob Frank could come up with a notion that all religions were equal and people can choose whatever religion
Mhm.
They won. It's a suburb. So my question about that was, even if he thought that, to write down, even in Hebrew, that the Holy Roman Emperor was weak in the mind. He had no gaius. That's how he writes it. You know, to write such a thing, how would he dare to do that? And my suspicion is that he's writing this, he finishes Divrei Binah in the year 1800. He tells us on the cover page. He finished it in 1800. By 1800, Joseph II had been dead for some years, and Europe and the Austrian Empire had entered a period of reaction. So lots of people thought that Joseph II was soft-headed because he had gone way too far in his policies and in his liberalism, his enlightenment. And so it wouldn't have been so dangerous. That's my guess to explain how he would dare to write such a sentence about the rule. But there are other things that he says that I don't know I don't understand there are passages I couldn't interpret. Not very many, because this is a very good time to be an Am Haaretz, an ignoramus, because we have the internet. So when something that he's writing involves a quotation from a part of the Zohar, and I know a little bit of Zohar, but not very much. I just type it in, and up comes the reference. It's a wonderful time to be ignorant, because you can find these things that otherwise, I would have had to go ask someone what it meant. He describes how he learned German. Was a German apprentice merchant wanted to learn Hebrew. And so they traded off, and they would meet in their spare time and teach each other the language. And of course, he learned it in 3 days. He learned German. He's brilliant, but this other fellow also learns Hebrew. And what interested me was he bought him a Siddur to help him to learn Hebrew. Now, this is Pasnish. You're not supposed to provide a prayer book to a Gentile, and certainly not for learning Hebrew. But he doesn't. He just says it by the way. He doesn't tell us whether he had any hesitation about that. Now, many parts of the book, you simply don't get the information you really want to have. He never mentions the Gaon of Vilna, which disappointed me. He also never mentions the weather, which also disappointed me.
Well, does he mention wine at any point?
Oh, yeah, there's lots. He's an expert on wine.
Right.
And he goes just about every year to Hungary, and he brings back massive quantities of wine on wagons pulled by oxen with these huge barrels of wine. And at one point, the Tisa River runs through the head. Anybody know Hungarian?
Fudge fudge.
And Jalia, I don't know how you really say it, but that region, the Tokai region of, and there's a river that you have to cross. There was no bridge at the time, and there was a flood, and he couldn't get across. He was stuck, and his drivers got drunk because they were waiting for the river to go down to the level so they could cross it. And he says he was very angry about them for getting drunk, and one of them embraced him in the manner of drunks, and he smelled on the breath of the driver a very fine wine. So he asked the driver where he got the wine, and he traced the source, and he bought a couple of barrels of this exquisite wine at a very good price. He
Great.
A lot
Great.
about wine, and he tells different qualities of wine and how he bargains with the various wine sellers.
Interesting.
I followed his route when I was in Lviv doing research. I followed his route by car through the Carpathians and into Hungary, and some of the wine cellars with a C, still exist that he dealt with. And we were able to see that the imperial wine cellars are exactly where they were when he was there, and some other places. So that was I learned a lot about Tokai. That was another, so I don't like Tokai very much. It's a sweet dessert wine.
Well, Rabbi Jim is very strict, and so we're going to have to be ending very shortly. And I would like to ask the last question, and then maybe we could stay on and schmooze a little. Those of us who are the schmoozers. Do you have any sense of how the book was received in the community? Is there any
It
way?
wasn't. I mean, it was never published.
Never published.
And it was deposited in Joseph Perel's library in Tarnopol. The memoir, Divrei Binah, was deposited there. And that's how it came to Jerusalem, because it was rescued. There's a whole story about how they brought that library over. The memoirs, we really have no idea at all. It appears in England, and nobody knows how it got there. There's no provenance. I mean, it was in the Jewish College Library. Now it's in the Jewish Theological Seminary Library. Nobody knows how it came, but I don't think anyone read it after his son-in-law, maybe, until the beginning of the 20th century, when this Vishnitzer found it in England, and when another scholar called Braver found Divrei Binah in Tarnopol. So there's no reception history of this stuff.
Wow.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
This was great.
Thank you so
It
much.
was wonderful.
Fascinating.
English is fascinating, and we could be here all night, but we do have to come to an end.
Sure.
And thank you all for coming. Thank you. Gershon, it's just been fabulous, and good luck with the publication of the manuscript.
Thank you.
And us old folks can stay on for a few minutes. And
I will make Sherry the host, so people can
Right.
lose as long as they want.
And thank you, Sherry, for organizing this.
Yes,
This is
it's
terrific.
amazing,
This
Sherry.
is
Thank you so
wonderful.
much. And thank you again, Gershon. This was
Okay.
really just really wonderful.
Thank you, Sherry. Thank you.
Jay, thanks for coming. Thanks for coming.
It was great.
I didn't have a chance to make my comment. I just
You
wanted.
didn't- oh, now you're raising your hand?
My hand was raised a little while ago.
I didn't see it.
No,
All right,
but
ask your question.
I know, but not everybody has great vision. But I just was saying that I was curious about the fact that I ran across in the biography of Brandeis, Louis Brandeis,
Yeah.
that his ancestors on both sides, his mother's side and his father's side, were Frankists.
Yes.
And that was kind of interesting that the Frankists continued for a while, and that they had an influence on people who actually came to America.
Yeah. There's a very nice article by Ben Halpern, who used to teach at Brandeis.
Yeah.
Brandeis was a descendant of the Vela family, which is a very prominent Sabatian family in Prague. And the orgies and all of that kind of disappeared. But the oppositionist stand, the rejection of the establishment, stayed in these family traditions. And Brandeis apparently was raised by or taught by his grandfather never to go along with the status quo, never to accept the establishment view. And Halpern suggests that this was part of the reformist impulse that characterizes his career. Certainly not the whole explanation, but that there was some ingredient of survival of this Sabatian heritage.
That's a really fascinating topic. So much to it.
Yeah, that's the climax of when I give my lecture to the undergraduates about this. The last line is that these traditions preserved. There were survivals of Sabatianism into the 20th century, and one of the great representatives of this tradition has a university named after him, and was a Supreme Court justice.
That's the problem with the denominations.
Elma,
No fun.
do you have a question? Can you unmute?
Who?
Yes, I can. Thank you. No, I just want to mention, I put a comment in the chat about the blood libel.
Or
and
the
people
Messina, yeah.
Yeah, people might write the case in Messina, New York in 1928, which was very interesting. And a professor who normally does French history from NYU wrote the book on it.
Right.
And I won't reveal to you how what his analysis was, how he finally figured out why this blood libel cropped up in upper New York State in 1928, because that would spoil the book. But just in case anybody's interested, the blood libel just seems to take on a life of its own and keep going.
Thank you. That's good. I wanted to remember, there's a book that's going to be published in English in November called The Books of Jacob. It's by Olga Tokarczuk, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature
That's right.
2 years ago. And it is all about Jacob Frank and Jacob Frank's symbolic importance in Polish history. And she did her research. There is a French translation already. There's a Hebrew translation already, but the English one has been announced for, I think, November. And I urge you to, if you're interested in such things, to have a look. She's a wonderful writer, Tokarczuk, really very talented, and it's worth seeing this book when it comes out.
All right. Well, this was fabulous. And I guess that people do have their lives to lead and so forth. But hopefully we'll get together and have a real schmooze. I mean,
Yeah, Gershon, if the Toronto Blue Jays can't even get to Canada,
Yeah.
how are we going
All
to
right.
see you?
It's a problem. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much.
You're
It's
welcome.
great to see
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Dina, what a treat to see you.
Say hi. I know this is such a treat. Please give my love to Ruth.
I will.
Yes, and give our love to Ruth
This
too.
is great.
Good night.
Yeah, good night,
Yeah,
everybody.
Good night, everybody. This was really great.
Good night.
Night. Thanks, Sherry.
My pleasure. Thanks to Gershon.